Your Excellency, former head of state for the Republic of Nigeria, Onikan, our chairman on this occasion, elder statesman, Onikan, our father of the day and the celebrant, Mr. Akintola, Williams, the president of Onikan here, Mr. Deru, representative of my leader, Tinubu, my brother, Mr. Wale, discussants on this distinguished lecture, Chief Nijora, I can see Dr. Kayode, I can see Alajo Kuno, I can see so many people. Let me plead that you allow me to, as we say in Nigeria, stand on existing protocol. I consider it a really great privilege to be here today to deliver this keynote address at the 2015 edition of the Akintola Williams Distinguished Lecture Series. It is most humbling to be granted this platform to in some way become associated with such a legend that has been blessed by Almighty God with productive longevity that those coming after him can only pray for. One of the few surviving first-generation nationalists who has been as much a part of where we're coming from as a nation and where we wish to be, as his legacy shines brightly as a light set on a hill, continually inspiring the vision of a functional nation in the hearts and minds of every sincere Nigerian patriot. Many of us here, particularly those who are older than myself, are familiar with Mr. Akintola Williams' giant strides in the private sector and social life. We know him as the first African to qualify as a chartered accountant. The chairman said as much. The founder of the largest professional services firm in Nigeria, Akintola Williams Deloitte, a co-founder of the Nigerian Stock Exchange, founder of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Nigeria, for which he also served as its first president. Some are also familiar, but maybe not as much about his activist nationalist life as they are of his professional life. Many may not know that he was a founding member of the Ekiti society while he was studying in London, with Dr. Kayode as the president and Chief Obafemi Awolowo as secretary. As well as to the fact that as a keen promoter of arts, culture, and music, he established these edifices and concert hall for the Music Society of Nigeria, which today serves as the venue of this august occasion. However, what many people don't know, which is particularly instructive, is that from public records available to us, Ms. Williams also excelled as a public servant. In fact, he started out as an assessment officer with the Inland Revenue Service between 1950 and 1952, before he went into private practice. He came back at different times to hold public sector positions, including serving as the chairman of the Federal Income Tax Appeal Commission between 1958 and 1968. He was member of the Corporate Commission of Inquiry into the Statutory Corporations of the former Western region of Nigeria, member of the Board of Trustees of the Commonwealth Foundation from 1966 to 75, chairman of the Lagos State Government Revenue Collection Panel, and chairman of the Public Service Review Panel to correct the anomalies in the Udoji Salary Review Commission. Many of us here born after 1975 may not even know what Udoji Salary Review Commission, except they read it in books. So for me, I am really indeed very happy to point to the curse of such a rich professional career and private life of integrity and excellence that our father, Chief Akintola Williams, has lived for, in confirming that even in this country, where some bad elements have given us an awful reputation in the international community, Nigeria remains a country where you can retain your good name even after holding sensitive public positions of trust. A country where you can win by righteousness. When we pray, as in the first stanza of our national anthem, that the labors of our heroes past shall never be in vain, we beseech God to grant that the sacrifices and the hard work of men like Mr. Williams will be veritable building blocks upon which we can build a new Nigeria we all seek. I therefore take this opportunity to congratulate Mr. Akintola Williams on the attainment of 96 years on earth. And wish him many more years in good health and pure joy. Now to substantive lecture, leadership factors and good corporate governance, key to national growth and development. When I was given this topic, I ruminated over what the organizers would really like me to talk about. Of course, I say leadership, and that's a recurring decimal in Nigeria. Everybody knows that leadership is a big challenge that we confront in our country, particularly deficit of good leadership. And I also see good corporate governance. I guess there's an assumption that good corporate governance or good corporate governance practices are beneficial to leadership development and leadership direction in our country. But to me, so often when things like the death of transparency, corruption, abuse of power are the subject of public discourse, the context is usually the political domain. We politicians are the scapegoats for all that is wrong in our country and are thought to be the most afflicted by such deficiency as lack of leadership quality, corruption, irresponsibility in office, and so on and so forth. And as a politician, I can certainly relate to this. The conversation on leadership, for example, tends inevitably to focus on political leadership as though this is the only form of leadership that matters or that exists. But this theme actually helps to take it beyond political leadership and hopefully find a nexus between corporate governance and public sector leadership as we explore progressive ideas for stimulating national growth and development. I'm not a corporate governance expert, but in writing this lecture, Googled and searched around for what would be regarded as the definition. And I came across one by a gentleman called James McRitchie, who says that corporate governance is most often viewed as both the structure and the relationships which determine corporate direction and corporate performance. The board of directors is typically central to corporate governance. Its relationship to the other primary participants, typically shareholders and management, is critical. Additional participants include employees, customers, suppliers, creditors, etc. The corporate governance framework also depends on the legal, regulatory, institutional, and ethical environment of the community. And it says that whereas the 20th century might be viewed as the age of management, the early 21st century has been predicted to be more focused on governance. Both terms address control of corporations, but governance has always required an examination of underlying purpose and legitimacy. And the thing that emerges from present-day definition is that in the 21st century, corporations are no longer perceived and narrowly defined as solely commercial entities. And when we look at some corporations around the world, we can confirm that to be the truth. We have corporations whose turnover is more than the turnover of 5 countries put together in Africa or more. Corporations are also no longer simply evaluated as being able, profit-making institutions, but as corporate citizens with broader responsibilities to society at large. Contemporary perspectives on corporate governance demand accountability to not just shareholders and management, but the entire society. And it's precisely because of this that the crisis of corporate governance in the early 2000s has become very, very prominent around the world. When a gale of scandals swept across the Wall Street in America, ravaging several American corporations and resulting in the high-profile collapses of establishments such as Enron, WorldCom, and Tyco due to financial fraud. The scandal also claimed the famed accounting firm Arthur Andersen, which was auditor to both Enron and WorldCom and was indicted for complicity in the fraud perpetrated by both corporations. The financial cost of these frauds were astronomical. Enron's stock collapse wiped out $67 billion in shareholder wealth, while the nosedive of WorldCom share cost investors over $175 billion. In the wake of the scandals, there was widespread recognition that these events had badly shaken investor confidence in the integrity of financial statements and that an overhaul of regulatory standards was required. We've also had our own share of corporate governance scandals. During the 1990s, the then newly liberalized banking sector became a theater of large-scale fraud as poorly run banks sucked up depositors' funds while promising unrealistic interest rates only to crash, leaving untold misery in its wake. This was the era of the cowboys who ran the so-called magic banks or wonder banks and allied financial institutions. In reality, many of those new banks were complicit in an elaborate regime of official graft and serving conduits for illegal remittances abroad by the ruling elite, and eventually collapsed during the gale of bank failures in the early 1990s. In 2009, the Securities and Exchange Commission disclosed that some bank chiefs gave some 388 billion naira in unsecured loans to investors without collaterals. Subsequently, these investors dumped the loans on the stock market, driving up share prices, thus triggering the declaration of fabulous profits and dividends. To shore up their profit margins, banks borrowed from each other at the end of their financial years. Ultimately, it was revealed that they had been using depositors' funds to hike their stock prices by lending to corporations and individuals who, in turn, invested in their bank shares. This edifice of fraud collapsed in 2008, and many here are familiar with what the central bank had to do in terms of new corporate governance codes in order to strengthen our banking system and other financial sector corporations. If Nigeria were to be taken as a private company, since we're talking about corporate governance, I think the mismanagement we have witnessed over the last years would have sadly made us declare bankruptcy. The symptoms of sovereign bankruptcy are, however, not merely economic. They are reflected in the wide-ranging dysfunction of institutions, rampant graft, and ultimately social unrest, from the militancy in the Niger Delta to the terrorist insurgency of Boko Haram in the northeast, to the various formats of random violence exercised by hostile non-state actors. All these plagues emanate from clearly failure of public sector leadership. In my view, the greatest expression of the failure of public sector leadership governance is the creation of extreme poverty and inequality in our society. The defining contradiction of Nigeria is that it is a country characterized by widespread poverty in the midst of plenty. Those who listen to my confirmation hearing would recall my statement about mindless wealth lying astride hopeless poverty. Even though we produce maximum crude oil production of 2.5 million barrels per day, and Nigeria ranks as Africa's largest producer of oil and the 6th largest oil producing country in the world, and has earned in the last 50 years $800 billion as revenue from oil. And we still have proven reserves of 180 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, certainly the largest on the continent. And even in recent years, our growth has averaged 7.4%, which according to the World Bank is one of the highest in the world. And an aggressive monetary policy has helped restrict inflation to single-digit levels. Judging from all these indices, our country ought to be an economic superpower in the realm of Singapore that our chairman talked about, or at least Malaysia, if not Singapore. But we're clearly not. A staggering 70% of our population, or about 112.5 million Nigerians, still live on below $2 per day. Poverty greatly curtails the access of millions of Nigerians to the elementary things of life: good health care, decent education, a broad spectrum of social and economic opportunities. We all know this, so I need not dwell on it. But what makes our paradox of poverty in the midst of plenty even more bizarre is that we claim to be the largest economy in Africa. And this has not translated into food on the table, roofs over the heads, and access to functional social services for the majority of our people. But what lessons can we learn from the corporate sector as we try to reorder public sector leadership in our country? Although I've highlighted certain aspects of corporate leadership that is less than impressive, and as discussed earlier, the Nigerian financial banking scandal of the 1990s and the mid-2000s exposed the wanton violation of business ethics and corporate governance codes by entrepreneurs who recognize no fidelity to their customers or duty to society at large. The pursuit of wealth clearly cannot be conducted at the expense of the society. What these bankers have in common with corrupt politicians and public servants is that lack of interest in the good of society. And among the many lessons to be learned from the banking crisis is the fact that the public sector has no monopoly of corruption. Neither is the private sector populated by saints. The discourse that depicts the public as bad as the private as good is unhelpful and should not be pursued. However, even in this false discourse, there are elements that we can take away as good corporate governance practices that those in public service must try as much as possible to emulate. And clearly, for the next generation of private sector leaders too, it's essentially that we recognize that one does not need a political office or title to become an exemplar of higher values. Ethical leadership is needed as much in the public sector as it is required in the private sector. And in the province of Nigerian business names, like Jomali Onosodi of blessed memory, Felix Ohiwere, of course, Pascal Dozier, Christopher Kolade, Fola Adiola, indeed, our father who in whose honor we're all gathered, Akintola Williams, to mention a few, have become synonymous with ethical enterprise. We similarly have their counterparts in public sector leadership, and we therefore have a rich repertoire of good examples to build on in envisioning values-based leadership in both the private and the public sector. One of the reasons for failure of corporate governance in ensuring the long-term sustainability of corporations account for why there's hardly any large indigenous corporation in Nigeria that is up to 100 years old. If we look at our history, those corporations that we celebrated in the 50s and the 60s, the Akintola group of companies, the Louis Ojukwu companies, and so on and so forth, have become largely ghosts of their old self now, due to, in my view, succession planning and strategic long-term vision. And these are issues that corporations are beginning to look at a lot more seriously. And I think increasingly, we now have a number of companies in Nigeria too that are taking succession planning and strategic long-term visioning into account and are beginning to outlive their founders. My very good example in that is the Guarantee Trust brand. First Bank, of course, has preceded it in that regard, both from the colonial era to what it is today, but there are still challenges that would need to be addressed. Similarly, any country that fails to plan for succession also plans to fail the leadership test. And much more. Embracing strategic thinking also means jettisoning our institutional and cultural predilection for short-termism. Successful development planning, like succession planning, is a long-term endeavor. Indeed, development planning cannot be separated from succession planning. The economic miracle of Southeast Asian nations was built on the back of long-term planning. China's emergence, which is perhaps the most talked about and analyzed development story of recent time, was nurtured over the course of 30 years, which is not even too long. Singapore's story from 1965 to now is also not too long, 50 years. These are countries we want to emulate. There's a valid debate over the possibilities of long-term strategic planning in a democracy with defined time limits. It is said that the problem with democratic environments is that cycles of regular electioneering impose short-term timelines which are not really conducive to long-term strategizing. Electorates tend to want immediate and tangible dividends to validate their confidence in their elected governments. Politicians, especially in our climate, are prone to crude populism, often making wild promises to perform immediate miracles once they are voted into office. The result, of course, is often mutual disappointment. What we therefore need is the strengthening of institutionalized long-term strategic planning that is not susceptible to the impulses of political cycles or political actors. We simply cannot afford to legitimize the reasons given by some of our African leaders for perpetuating themselves in power indefinitely. In this regard, it has to be said that Africa's legacy of developmental underachievement even has something to do with longevity of some leaders in office. What we see in Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi today, and the propensity for violence in those countries in terms of the pursuit of perpetuation of power clearly attests to this. Indeed, the fact that the 10 current longest ruling non-royal national leaders of independent countries in the world today, 6 of them are Africans, with the top 3 of them, Paul Biya of Cameroon, 40 years, Teodoro Mbasogo of Equatorial Guinea, 36 years, and Jose Eduardo dos Santos of Angola, another 36 years, cannot be unconnected with the slow pace of development in these resource-rich countries. Although they're resource-rich, And if indeed longevity is a factor for development, you would have expected that the two factors would have come together to increase the level of development in this country, but that's not what we've seen in either Equatorial Guinea or Cameroon. Indeed, longevity has resulted in transformation of their economies into the backwardness. For the most part, progress has been hobbled by longevity. In terms of the paradigm shift, therefore, apart from strategic planning and succession planning, there are other values that we can learn from good corporate governance, and I underline the word good. Transparency and accountability is the very first one for me. In these days of shareholder democracy and activist shareholders, there's a greater demand for accountability from companies. And accountability is not just in terms of profit. It's also in terms of the contribution of companies to people, that is society, and to the planet as a whole. Many organizations have adopted frameworks of evaluating their performance in this broader context. And the bottom line doesn't just refer to profit or loss, but to their contribution to social justice, to environmental protection, and many of them are seen to also be good corporate citizens by introducing corporate social responsibility into their work. As democratization deepens in Nigeria, issues of transparency and accountability have also become more salient. In 2013, the National Assembly passed the Freedom of Information Act. And this is a significant milestone in our national journey precisely because it signifies the opening up of governance. And you have institutions like budgets, like the Center for Democracy and Development, civil liberties organizations, holding the feet of those in public office to fire in terms of transparency and accountability. A good example here has been the whole debate around asset declaration by public sector leaders, which eventually saw the declaration of the assets of Mr. President and his vice, and hopefully I believe those who are going to be ministers in this government, having seen this example, will not shy away from also publicly declaring their assets in the interest of transparency and accountability. We can also see that the new administration is paying more than lip service to the issue of transparency, considering that the NNPC, the oil corporation, for the first time in many years, is now publishing details of its earnings. This has always been an issue of acrimony between the federal government and the state governors because of the secrecy that has hitherto characterized the regime of income generation from the oil and gas industry. And I don't think this is unconnected with the fact that the person who leads NNPC now comes from an institution that is very strong on corporate governance, on transparency, and on accountability, and he's been able to infuse that into the work that he is doing. Of course, helped by President Buhari's desire for probity, for transparency himself, and playing by the rules that would be seen by ordinary Nigerians as accountable and transparent. I think another area that increasingly some work is being done in the private sector, and which I know that the public sector is paying attention to, is management of diversity. Managing diversity and ensuring inclusion is a factor of growth that has become very important to leadership in the business environment and in the public sector. In the world today, every serious organization that I know has a charter that addresses non-discrimination on the basis of gender, of age, of sex, tribe, religion, physical ability, health status, and any other social markers. Some companies even go a step further to ensure a certain percentage of their board and staff is constituted by minorities. Consequently, it is not at all strange that there's a renewed drive in corporations and governments to create more gender diverse environments. Women constitute 50% of the workforce, and any system that excludes women actually eliminates potentially 50% of productive potential, a disruption that militates against growth and profit.